Welcome back to Viral Shakespeare. This is Dr. Rusty Jones, and today we are moving on to Shakespeare's The Tempest. Composition date, circa 1610, 1611, somewhere around there. We do have a record of a performance at the court of James I on November 1st, 1611, and the work was published in 1623. So we only have the folio version of the play, no quarto versions to confuse things. And it is the very first play published in the 1623 folio under comedies, but I'll get into that a little bit more soon. Other Shakespeare plays from the period, such as Henry VIII from 1612, Cardenio, also from around 1612, now lost. We don't have that play fully that we know of. And The Two Noble Kinsmen from 1613 show evidence of co-authorship with John Fletcher. So The Tempest, which comes a little before that group, seems to be written wholly by Shakespeare himself. No John Fletcher inserting scenes, no Thomas Middleton inserting scenes. Basically, this is Shakespeare's work wholly by himself as opposed to some of the other ones. Let's see, the source. Let's talk about the source for a minute. I've got some notes on it over here. Shakespeare, as I've spoken of before, tends to draw from other material and then adapt it for his own dramatic purposes. Two plays that we don't have very clear sources for that are actually related, one from early in Shakespeare's career, one from later in Shakespeare's career, A Midsummer Night's Dream from early in his career, and The Tempest from late in his career. They have a lot of things in common, magic and a kind of fairy tale quality to them, and some really strong comedic elements and fantasy and reunion, wedding, justice, that kind of thing. They do have a lot in common, generally speaking, but both of them don't have a clear, identifiable source. They have a kind of a mishmash of basic sources that Shakespeare put together and developed into his own work. For The Tempest, however, although we don't have one singular, easily identifiable source, most scholars of Shakespeare do point to this work as influential in the development of The Tempest. And it is William Strachey's True Reportery from 1610. And this makes for a pretty good story. So let me stop for a minute and tell you about Strachey's True Reportery, which was very likely circulating around in manuscript around 1610. The actual published version of Strachey's report doesn't happen until many years later, but it's likely that Shakespeare had access to this in manuscript around 1610. So in Strachey's True Reportery, we get a report of the wreck and recovery of the ship named the Sea Adventure. Now, nothing really that remarkable about it until you look into the details. The Sea Adventure left Plymouth, England in June 1609, so the summer of 1609, bound for the Virginia colony, and just suddenly kind of vanished off the map. One ship was finally, as they found out later, was lost. Others simply seemed to vanish. And then, in May 1610, so almost an entire year later, two of the ships, the Sea Adventure included, turn up in Virginia. Basically, all hands intact, the ship's intact, everybody seemingly unharmed and healthy. Almost a year later, after basically vanishing off the face of the earth. What happened? Where did it go? Well, as it turned out, the Sea Adventure and company were shipwrecked in the Bermudas, which is off the east coast of America by quite a distance, about 700 miles, I think, from Jamestown, thereabouts. And besides having essentially a few reported mutinies while they were shipwrecked in the Bermudas, the folks there managed to repair their ships. They found food, they found water, they found assistance, they managed to survive. They put their boats back together, and then by May, they show up in Virginia, basically unharmed. Imagine getting that report back in Plymouth, England, or London, or wherever you are, after May 1610. It must have appeared absolutely miraculous. How does this happen? A series of ships gone for almost a year, turns up unharmed? Amazing. Was it magic? Was it a miracle? Was it evidence of God's divine grace being brought down for just these people that managed to survive? I don't know, but certainly for them, it was an adventure tale with a kind of miraculous quality to it, with a magical miraculous quality to it, that no doubt Shakespeare found very enticing, and it very easily could have basically influenced the development of the Tempest as a story. Another source that's pointed to frequently is Michel de Montaigne's essay of the Cannibals, translated into English in 1603, which praises Native American society as utopian, and I'll talk about that in the future. Remember, too, that the Virginia colony of Jamestown had only been recently established. It was established in 1607. So by the time all this stuff starts to happen in 1609, 1610, the New World is still kind of an unknown quality. The first Jamestown expedition had gone very, very badly. And so it was an adventurous time, which I'll talk about in the future under the terms of colonialism, where the possibility of miracles, magic, monsters, rescue, all of this sort of adventure tale stuff that I'm going to talk more about in a minute here, was suddenly possible. The old world, with all of its old customs, and as I mentioned before in the last lecture, the idea that miracles are kind of passé, suddenly with the New World, these things are possible again. And here's the Sea Adventure showing us, in some ways, a literal miracle. So let's talk about the Tempest for a second, as far as genre is concerned. As I mentioned to you in the folio, there are only 3 genres. There are comedies, histories, and tragedies, and that's it. Very likely that Shakespeare conceived this work as a comedy. However, and as I mentioned, it does appear as the very first comedy in the folio, and the very first work in the folio. But as I've mentioned before, there's a little bit of a twist on this. As early as 1817, William Hazlitt defined another work from late in Shakespeare's career, a play called Cymbeline, as, quote, a dramatic romance. And the classification of romance has evolved over time to include a number of Shakespeare's plays from late in his career, including Pericles, that's about 1607 or 1608, Cymbeline, as I mentioned, 1609, 1610, The Winter's Tale, again around 1610, and The Tempest, 1610, 1611. These plays are often grouped together under the category of romance. Did Shakespeare clump those groups under romance? No, he did not. But Hazlitt's right. For the majority of those works, the romance structure tends to apply. And so I want to take a minute and talk about what romance is, although to classify The Tempest as a comedy is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But let's talk about the structure of romance for a second. I'm going to back up a little bit so I can hold this up to you. There we go. This is a typical romance structure for a romance narrative. Now, romance just basically means a story, but the romance as a genre goes way back in time, and the structure tends to be, relatively speaking, consistent. So, at the beginning of a romance, you have boy meets girl, or, in some cases, boy meets something else, girl meets something else. In Frederick Douglass' narrative of Frederick Douglass, the slave narrative that he wrote, which chronicles his path toward freedom. In that one, Douglass himself is separated from his freedom, his identity, a sense of justice, and the whole rest of the narrative is about how he became reunited again with his identity, with his freedom, with a sense of his humanity to some degree. But in this case, let's go back to boy meets girl, boy is separated from girl. How are they separated? Well, romance tends to like lots of different things. Cast your minds back to Romeo and Juliet. Feuding families separate boy and girl. War, age difference, financial differences, and of course, pirates. Don't forget pirates. Romances are big on pirates. If you've ever seen a romance novel, you've got a woman with a lot of décolletage showing and Fabio with his shirt off holding her in a kind of repose like this. Pirates are very popular for separating boy and girl. And then boy and girl have to begin what is basically a journey toward reunification, reunion, and a sense of justice, that the universe is in fact an orderly and kind place. And as they go through their various trials and tribulations, they encounter many fantastic properties. They encounter magic, they encounter torture, they encounter war, They encounter monsters. For the woman, there will be what is perceived of as a rape, which actually may or may not occur. There is, notice this term over here, Scheintod. That's a German term. It means fake death. That is very popular in romance fiction. The boy thinks that the girl has died, and so he goes into his paroxysms of grief, and that makes their reunion later in the piece all the more emotionally satisfying, and they can go through their great emotional paroxysms. They can freak out and be so much happier when they get back together again. Romeo and Juliet looked like it was heading that direction, so we could have a heightened sense of emotion at their reunion. Everything could work out. You'd have a universe that was just and honorable, and the fact that we as audience want boy and girl to be together will be satisfied, and we'll feel that justice has been served, and then that rug is yanked out from under us in Romeo and Juliet. You also sometimes in monsters have ROUSs. I mentioned that last time. That's rodents of unusual size from The Princess Bride. I love that piece as both a parody of the romance structure and a romance in and of itself. And I mentioned the outrage of the young boy who's having The Princess Bride read to him by his grandfather, who wants everything to work out just. The boy and the girl have to get back together. The villain has to be defeated. Otherwise, it's not fair, and why would you read me this thing? Magic, fantasy, near death, or as they say in The Princess Bride, mostly dead, but not all dead. All of these things are possible. Miracles. All these things are possible in the romance. It's a fantasy of travel. It's a fantasy where the universe itself will reward people for the trials and tribulations that they go through. Something that doesn't happen in a tragedy like Lear, that doesn't happen in a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, but does happen in a romance like The Tempest, if you choose to call it that. Let's see. It's very tempting, another note I have to myself here, to read The Tempest as a romance in a kind of, or through a kind of biographical lens. I want to caution people about doing that. It's tempting, I understand that, to look at Shakespeare's overall career and say, oh, well, as a young man, he was interested in comedy. And that makes sense because young people are interested in all things comic. They like things that are funny. They like it when you have weddings and everything works out in the end like comedies tend to do. And yes, a lot of plays written early in Shakespeare's career are comedies. And then it's very tempting again to say that when someone reaches maturity, they become more serious, they become interested in tragedy. And yes, if you look back at Shakespeare's works, he does have a kind of grouping of tragedies in the middle to later part of his life. And then as he gets older, relatively speaking, remember 1564 to 1616, I wouldn't exactly call this guy old, 52 years old basically when he dies. But then late in his life, he becomes interested in romance. He becomes interested, I know it's tempting to see this, in what is not strictly speaking tied to reality, in what is fantastical, in what is magical, in what's satisfying in the universe in that way, and the possibility of forgiveness. I mentioned to you that in King Lear, one of the things that's most satisfying is in Act 4 when Cordelia says, no cause. I have no cause to be angry at you. I forgive you. And he forgives her. He doesn't really have any reason to do it, but they come back together again in forgiveness, and then it's cut short by the universe that wants them dead, and Edmund and company that wants them dead. So we don't get that full satisfaction of forgiveness. But in romances, you do. And one of the most stirring that I can mention to you is The Winter's Tale, and I encourage you to check that one out. In that one, Leontes is a man who just flies into a jealous rage for really no reason whatsoever, locks his wife Hermione up. She gives birth in prison to Perdita. She apparently dies, but it turns out, spoiler alert, turn this off if you don't want to hear it, she's been squirreled away for a while. She's been hidden by Paulina. And by the end, she is represented to her husband, Leontes, who understands the depth of what he's done as far as being wrong and being unfair and being unjust. And Hermione is represented to him in the form of a statue. But it's really her. And she descends from the plinth and basically hugs her daughter, who she never got a chance to know, Perdita, and forgives her husband. And the family is to some degree reunited. And it sounds silly when you say it because, oh my gosh, a statue comes to life. which it doesn't really, but it comes to life and comes down and forgives the whole family. But when you see it, it's part of the magic of stagecraft, and it is beautiful. And The Tempest, in a lot of ways, also acknowledges that the magic of stagecraft and the beauty of moral forgiveness can be stunning. And The Tempest has that in common with The Winter's Tale. So, let's see, is that all the introduction I wanted to do? Well, I did want to mention the setting of Prospero's Island. The Bermudas are mentioned in the play itself, but it's unclear whether or not Prospero's Island is meant to be Bermuda or inspired by Bermuda. It is both a very real place and a very unreal place, a very magical place, a space of imagination. It is utopia in the sense that in some ways it's a perfect kind of blank slate, and in some very real sense it cannot exist. It also does to some degree represent the New World, which brings in the question of colonialism, which I will talk about next time, not this time. And the figure of Caliban is the one that sits centrally in this question of whether or not we should view the setting of Prospero's Island as the New World or a kind of meditation on the New World, which I will talk about more in the future. Okay. Let's see if that's all the notes that I wanted to mention. Yes, in fact, it is. So let's get into the play itself, Act 1, Scene 1. And it opens, imagine that, with a tempest. And a tempest is a gigantic storm. Now, this is not the same tempest, I would argue, as the tempest in which Lear is raving against nature that is just absolutely uncaring as far as the state of man is concerned. Lear can sit there and command it all that he wants to, tell it to rip the world apart, but it doesn't matter because nature doesn't care about some crazy old man and a fool raving against nature. It's just going to go ahead and rain storms down on his white head. But this is not the same tempest, although it appears to be one that is absolutely apocalyptic. It's going to tear the ship apart. It's going to kill everybody on it, no matter what social class they're sitting at. As it turns out, it's not that. This is one controlled by the structures of romance. It is one that is spurned on by the magic of an individual, in this case Prospero, who's using the storm not in an uncaring way, although we can certainly question his motives, but not in an uncaring way. He's doing it to bring his enemies to him and to bring Ferdinand to his daughter Miranda, so that, because she has reached maturity at this point, he can couple them up in a way that to us is a little bit creepy, but could be presented in a way that is romantic. Watch the air quotes there. So, The Tempest. A tempestuous noise of thunder and lightning heard, enter a shipmaster and a boatswain. How did they do this on the stage? Well, I've talked about this before with regard to King Lear. You can have lots of different stagecraft in Shakespeare's time. You can have cannonballs rolling around wooden gutters. You can have a kind of wooden wind machines. You can have flash powder. You could have people with wooden cones making all sorts of horrendous noises. You can have people jumping from the balcony on the globe with large pieces of cloth to simulate sails. You can have ropes left and right to simulate the ship. You can have people tottering back and forth like on Star Trek, where it's like, whoa, the camera this way, and whoa, the camera that way. And believe it or not, it's a lot more effective than you would think. You can really convince people, not fully of course, but they will get immersed in the fantasy world of this storm that looks like it's going to engulf absolutely everybody. The master says, "Boatswain, here, master, what cheer? Good, speak to the mariners, fall to it yarely, readily, quickly, let's get to it, or we're going to die. Or we run ourselves aground. Bestir, get moving." Alonso, the king of Naples, pops up to find out what's happening with the sailors in this storm. Very likely he comes up through the trapdoor. That would make sense. If this is the deck of the ship that we're looking at, the globe stage, it makes sense that the nobles are hiding underneath for the time and letting the sailors risk their life. "Good boatswain," says the king of Naples, Alonso. "Good boatswain, have care. Where's the master? Play the men. Be resolute, be strong. Save us," basically. The boatswain, "I pray now, keep below." Antonio, the evil brother of Prospero, and we will interrogate what it means to call him evil. "Where is the master, boatswain?" says Antonio, and the boatswain says, "Do you not hear him? You mar our labor. Keep your cabins. You do assist the storm." "Nay, good," says Gonzalo, the kind old counselor. "Be patient." The boatswain, when the sea is. Hence, get lost. What cares these roarers, the waves, for the name of king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not. This is quite the violation of social customs, to be yelling at nobility that they are nothing but in the way. But I really like this. Shakespeare's quite often interested in social leveling. We saw it in Henry V, for example. But what he's doing here is quite interesting, where it's like when it's a life and death situation, the ceremony that Henry V mentions right before the Battle of Agincourt, that really the only thing that separates him from his subjects is the idea of ceremony. Well, what's the point of ceremony when you're about to die in a tempest? It's all out the window. All social customs are out the window. But Gonzalo, Antonio, Alonso, and company, they're still clinging to this idea that even in a life and death situation, these things matter. Gonzalo says, "Good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard." Don't smart talk us. I've got the king down here. "None that I more love than myself," says the boatswain. "You are a counselor. If you can command these elements to silence and work the peace of the present, we will not hand a rope more. Use your authority. If you cannot, give thanks you have lived so long, and make yourself ready in your cabin for the mischance of the hour, if it so hap. Cheerily, good hearts. Out of our way, I say," and he exits. Gonzalo says, essentially to us, the listening audience, "I have great comfort from this fellow," this saucy fellow here. "Methinks he hath no drowning mark upon him." I don't think that he will be a man drowned. "His complexion is perfect gallows." He will hang for his impudence. Well, no, he won't. If we were in that kind of world, yeah, maybe that would happen. You would hang for your impudence. But here, in a romantic structure, in a comedic structure, no, that is not going to happen. He can be impudent to the nobility. "Stand fast, good fate," says Gonzalo, "to his hanging. Make the rope of his destiny our cable, for our own doth little advantage. If he be not born to be hanged, our case is miserable." Enter the boatswain again, ordering his men around, and as the nobles pop up again, the boatswain again lets them have it, as well he should. "Yet again, what do you here? Shall we give over and drown? Have you a mind to sink?" And Sebastian, the brother of King Alonso, "A pox on your throat, you bawling, blasphemous and charitable dog." And the boatswain says, "Work you then." Ja love. We're all in the same boat, literally, particularly in this kind of terrible circumstance. You want to come up and order us around? Fine, work while you do it. Absolutely level. Antonio, "Hang, cur, hang, you hoarse and insolent noisemaker. We are less afraid to be drowned than thou art." I find that highly, highly doubtful. They continue to argue until finally we hear a confused noise within the ship itself. "Mercy on us. We split, we split. Farewell, my wife and children. Farewell, brother. We split, we split." And as it appears, the ship has been destroyed. But as we find out, that is not, in fact, the case. Act 1, Scene 2, we cut to Prospero and Miranda, and this is where we learn that the whole thing has been engineered by the magic of Prospero, who has the elements under his control as a magus, as a wise man, as an arch magician. This is not the same kind of magic, and if this kind of thing interests you, you might want to look into this, that, say, King James was worried about with regard to witches. Macbeth is full of witches. James I apparently presided over some witch trials during his time. Apparently, he wrote a book on demonology where he shows a great concern about witches. It's not correct, I don't think, in most cases to view Prospero as that kind of witch with evil intent that can ruin your crops and set people adrift, etc., with the intent to murder them. In this case, what appears to be negative magic in that way is actually positive magic. He is bringing the people there from the boat unharmed, although it seems like they've been harmed. All the sailors go to sleep under deck. They've been tucked away in a little cove, all nice and safe and sound. Ferdinand has been put at that part of the island. Antonio and company have been put on the other end of the island. And Prospero's making them work for the forgiveness that he will eventually give them, to bring them across the island and bring them to him. So it appears that what he's doing is witchcraft, but it's more magus-like. It's more the wise man being the puppeteer and controlling all aspects of the situation, to what he feels will be eventually the benefit of all, himself and Miranda, perhaps at the foremost. Miranda, looking over the Tempest, says to her father, Act 1, Scene 2, "If by your art, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them, stop them. The sky, it seems, would pour down stinking pitch, but that the sea, mounting to the welkin's cheek, dashes the fire out. Oh, I have suffered with those that I saw suffer. A brave vessel who had no doubt some noble creature in her." She comes back to this later about the world being full of noble creatures that she's never seen before. It shows her empathy, her sympathy, her desire to be with others that she's never seen before. Dashed all to pieces. Oh, the cry did knock against my very heart. Poor souls, they perished. Had I been any god of power, I would have sunk the sea within the earth, or ere it should the good ship so have swallowed, and the frotting souls within her. Well, her father is that kind of demigod with his power, his theatrical power in this case, to control the situation, and he's going to put her heart at ease on this subject. "Be collected," he says, Prospero, to his daughter. "No more amazement. Tell your piteous heart there's no harm done." "Oh, woe the day," Miranda continues to lament. "No harm," says Prospero. "I have done nothing but in care of thee, my dear one, thee, my daughter, who art ignorant of what thou art, not knowing of whence I am, nor that I am more better than Prospero, master of a full porcel, and thy no greater father." We need to stop for a minute. We need to look at those words. I'm going to check my time here. I'm running a little bit short. No big surprise there. But we need to look at those words carefully. Not only is he telling Miranda, "No, I haven't hurt anybody. Don't worry about it. They're all safe and sound. I have done nothing but in care of thee." All that tempest, all of that wreck and horror that you witnessed there and seemingly people drowning, I did it for you. Everything is for you. And romance, as I mentioned, the structure is to bring the boy and girl back together again in reunion. In this case, if the romance is about Miranda and Ferdinand, then okay. But other things that have been separated, Prospero's been separated from his dukedom. Justice has been separated from the world. But he says, everything I've done, I have done for you, my dear one, and you don't even know who you are, nor are you really aware who I am. So I'm going to give you the backstory now. Now, of course, the backstory of this whole thing is for our benefit, of course, but I think it's interesting that he's had Miranda there on the island for, as we hear, 15 years. I mean, she was 3 when they fled, were put in the rickety boat, given provisions by Gonzalo, set adrift, and then they arrived on the island, and they've been there for 12 years. So Miranda's 15 years old. So for 12 years, out of her 15, she's been kept completely ignorant of who she is. And the only people she's encountered on the island, to her knowledge, are her father and the monster Caliban, and that's basically it. She knows more about her backstory, partially because of the nobility that's kind of built into her in this way. She has some memory of it. But it's interesting that he has kept her absolutely ignorant so that he could reveal it at this moment, when she is 15, when she has reached let's call it maturity. It's not the Juliet 13. It's, barely better than that. But let's say maturity to some degree. And when the advantage is there because his enemies have been sailing past his island and he has the opportunity to bring them to him. The time is ripe for him to reveal all and to show her, I should say, just an inkling of the plan that he has for her improvement and for his return to the old world. I'm going to stop there. I will pick up with this on Wednesday. We will get all the way through Act 2 of The Tempest. We'll have some fun. We will get to forgiveness. Stay safe. Be well. Take care.